Buenas tardes, estimados alumnos. Me da mucho gusto estar con ustedes por estos pocos momentos que vamos a estar juntos por medio de este video. Good evening or afternoon, my wonderfully esteemed students, depending on the time you view this video. It brings me great pleasure to be with you all for the next few moments. We're going to be together via this lecture. So I'm going to lecture a little bit over chapters 1 and 2. It's not going to be a comprehensive or exhaustive lecture because there's a lot of concepts and ideas embedded into it, but it is just to provide you all some instructional overviews related to some of the key takeaways or key ideas from the chapter. Okay, so let me go ahead and get started. I hope you all are doing well. Let's see, this thing is not wanting to respond. All right, so the first thing is, let's go ahead and begin with a question around what exactly is a problem, right? A social problem. One of the key things that I want to kind of bring to your attention is that, first of all, a social problem has to affect a particular demographic or sector of the population in which we live and the well-being of that population, or at least the perception of well-being for that population. Usually a considerable number of individuals sometimes constitutes what a social problem is, but not necessarily always. Okay, you can have a really large number of individuals being impacted by a particular social problem, and that could, by definition, meet the criteria for being a social problem because of the sheer magnitude or considerable number of people affected by it. Or it could be something that's not really affected by a lot of people, but is still considered a social problem, and that's because of the subjective nature of it. Okay, so in order for a social problem to exist, you got to have two dynamics associated with it. The first one is there has to be some kind of objective condition that is objectively affecting the well-being of some segment of the population in society. That means by objective, we mean it's something concrete, it's something verifiable, it's something that you can document. And then the other aspect of that objective condition is that it has to have some kind of degree or magnitude. It has to be something that is real. The second part to that, the second dynamic associated with a social problem, is that it has to have some kind of subjective component to it. Okay, and the subjective component to a social problem is how it personally and experientially affects individuals, irrespective of the objective, documentable or documented and verifiable condition that exists. Okay, so there has to be some kind of an awareness of the threat, and not just the condition or the existence of a particular condition that's affecting the well-being of people. Okay, so you can have millions and millions and millions of people being exterminated in concentration camps, but it's not going to be seen as a social problem because the subjective component, the subjective dynamic is lacking, right? So during World War II with the concentration camps in Europe and in Germany, the homosexuals, the racial minorities, the people with disabilities, intellectual disabilities, as well as racial minorities like Jews and others, political dissidents, all were being exterminated in large numbers, but there wasn't an awareness of those exterminations and of the taking of the loss of people's lives. And so because there was no subjective awareness of the threat and of the harm that was being done, then it didn't constitute a social problem. Okay. All right. So that's one thing I want you all to kind of keep in mind. The other part about the subjective component or dynamic to a social problem is that there's generally some kind of values that are being compromised, being threatened, or being threatened or compromised. Okay, so the values that we subjectively possess and hold dear to our hearts, either culturally through the process of socialization or just broader social forces at work that lead to the internalization of these values, are being threatened or compromised, or just basically being removed. All right, so one thing I want you to also be mindful of is this thing here, which basically says that our attitudes around social problems are shaped by the membership that we have in particular social groups. So for example, white Americans generally white Americans don't list as one of their top 3 social problems racism. They don't list racism as one of the top 3 social problems. Conversely, men generally, as a social group, don't list sexism as a social problem, right? Um, People with resources generally don't list poverty as a social problem, right? Because our perception, our experience and interactions and awareness of social problems is shaped by, and our sense making around social problems is shaped by our group membership. So generally speaking, if you think about it in terms of racial identity, in terms of gender identity, and even in terms of economic identity, each of those groups that we just talked about possesses a relatively privileged status in that experience of either oppression or disadvantage or dynamics of discrimination. So because of the relatively insulated racially insulated lives white Americans live, their awareness of racism is not as chronic, certainly not as pronounced, and certainly not as acute as that of the experiences of racial minorities. And again, conversely, the same thing with men, right? Men, right, as males, generally their awareness of, their experience with, their interactions with dynamics of sexism are not from a subordinate position, right? Generally speaking, sexism is foisted on women, okay? And as a result of that, like men are unaware of, or maybe not unaware of sexism, right? Like men acknowledge it exists, but it's not really seen as a problem for men because they're the ones doling it out, right? And the same thing again for people with particular economic resources. You know, the people with resources are in a relatively privileged position in the dynamic of oppression that's related to socioeconomic status and attainment. And as a result of that positionality, they don't see, they're not the acuteness, the awareness, the chronic exposure to dynamics of discrimination related to resources are not present in their lives, right? They're the recipients of that. And so that's one thing I want you all to kind of keep in mind. And I've given you some examples here, right? Domestic violence generally isn't listed as a problem for men, unless, of course, they're witnessing it happen to their daughters or their wives or their partners, or someone they love. The incarceration, for example, the criminal justice system and the racialized incarceration, the mass incarceration of people of color, not necessarily a problem for some demographics of our population. But certainly so for others. All right. So, all right. I'm going to try to be as succinct as I can in these presentations because I know that as I've gotten older, my lectures are more and more boring. Here's another kind of classic example of how the objective and subjective dynamics associated with social problems have to be present. You know, let's look at this first row right here. So is it subjectively considered a very serious problem, right? So let's take, for example, you've got this part and then you've got on this side, does it objectively cause serious harm? Let's just look at the objective reality, right? Does this problem we're going to look at harm thousands of people, right? So if you say yes, you can look at this row, it says homicide. So homicide harms objectively thousands of people a year, millions of people probably a year, right? So we see it, does it objectively cause harm? Yes, right? Is it subjectively considered a very serious problem? Yes. It is. Homicide, murder is considered a serious social problem, not just because it affects millions, if not thousands of people, thousands, if not millions of people. It's also considered a social problem because of the fact that it's a very heinous violation of one of the values we hold dear in our society, which is the value of life. Okay, so you've got that there. Now, let's take a look at the second area, right? Does it objectively seriously cause harm to thousands, if not millions of people? The use of automobiles, yes. People die, millions, thousands, hundreds of thousands probably of people, maybe even millions. I'm not really sure statistically, but thousands, if not tens of thousands of people die every year in automobile accidents. But we don't consider it a serious social problem, right? So it's possible to have one dynamic, objectivity, but maybe the subjective nature isn't there, right? We don't see the use of automobiles as a social problem, even if thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are injured or killed every year or harmed. Let's take another one, right? So if you look at, does it objectively cause serious harm to thousands of people? School shootings, right? Not a lot of people die in school shootings, right? A very minuscule amount. Statistically speaking, when you look at the 375 million people in the United States. So not a lot of people, the objective criteria is not there. The objective dynamics not there for school shootings, but we still perceive it subjectively as a serious social problem, right? So for example, the shooting, the school shooting that took place in Uvalde, Texas, where I think like 35 kindergartners were executed by this person, of kindergartners and first graders. That was, we consider it a serious social problem, even if thousands of people are not being murdered or shot in schools, right? The use of iPods or iPads, right? So the use of iPads, it doesn't cause a lot of serious harm to thousands of people. So we don't consider it a social problem, right? So that just highlights the social construction aspects of social problems, and specifically the two components, the two dynamics associated with the social construction for social problems, which is objectivity, objective conditions, and then subjective conditions as well. Okay, all right. So the objective condition is necessary, but not always sufficient, like we just looked at when we talk about the murder of millions of people in the concentration camps. You can have millions of people being terminated inside concentration camps, but it not be considered a social problem because of the way it's either framed by people with power, like the Nazis framed the concentration camps as labor camps, or because people are unaware of it, right? So awareness is key, and that goes to this next part of the slide, which is the definition of the situation, how people define particular situations, and then the claims making associated with it. Another really important part of the social problem, I guess, formulation is the fact that our values play a role in the construction of social problems. Usually, social problems are constructed as a result of conflict or conflicting values or conflict in the values that we hold dear. So, for example, some of us may consider environmental pollution to be a social problem that needs to be addressed. But some of these same people may continually buy plastic bottled waters because it's convenient. It's more convenient, certainly, than carrying one of these around everywhere you go, right? So, or for example, we may think of during the 1920s and the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, the Prohibition era, we prohibited alcohol. We felt that alcohol as a society was something that should be outlawed. But we also have freedom in the United States, right? So we have the tension of morality and alcoholism and alcohol consumption, and then the value of freedom, and those conflicted. And ultimately, we passed laws. We passed an amendment saying you can no longer sell or buy alcohol. And then we created an entire economy around, or an entire economic structure around the consumption, purchase, and transportation of alcohol. And this is epitomized by Al Capone, right? You think about what happened during September 11th, right? In September 11th, we had a global conflict in terms of what happened with the destruction of the Twin Towers. Thousands of American citizens were killed by individuals who ideologically disagreed with the values that we possess in terms of what freedom looks like to us, right? So individuals, some radicalized Muslims from the Middle East, took these planes, slammed into them. They considered the United States to be the great Satan, the producer of pornography, the producer of corruption and greed and everything that the Muslim world perceived to be as insidious, or at least these radical Muslims perceived. And as a result, they ended up trying to stop our economy, right, and trying to grind our nation to a halt. And there's other examples here, right? So, for example, the war on drugs, right? Again, the issue of morality is something related to the war on drugs, and how we think people should be sober-minded. At least that's part of the Protestant ethic that has historically undergirded the United States. Yet we have freedom, and people in the United States are free to consume certain things, provided they're a particular age. So you've got lots of examples that you look around, but the bigger idea that I want you to take away from this is that social problems are constructed generally with some kind of causation related to the conflict or tension that is present in the roles and actually in the values that we possess as a society. Okay, all right. So when we talk about the stages of a social problem, social problems don't just kind of like pop up out of nowhere. Generally, they unfold in some kind of ways. So the first one is there's this emergent first stage, which is related to the claims making that people begin to create around a particular issue that is affecting their well-being subjectively, or maybe even objectively, and the awareness that's necessary for people to begin to start seeing that this is a social problem that needs to be addressed. The second stage is coming into this coalescence stage, or this legitimacy stage, where now you begin to coalesce federal, local, and state resources, or state, local, and federal awareness and attention to the awareness of the seriousness or legitimacy of this social problem. So it has to be legitimated, and that's generally the second stage of a particular social problem. The third part is where you end up with these, it's like the formalization of the social problem. You have renewed claims around it, and generally the policy determinations, the policy debates around how exactly it is to be addressed, like what exactly are we supposed to do about the social problem that's now gained legitimacy and that now we are aware of and people have made claims around. And that's where you end up with these different tensions associated with the policy determination, because if we think about, for example, undocumented migration in the United States, undocumented migration in the United States has lots of ways through which it can be addressed, right? And it depends where you are politically and ideologically, because on the right, you have individuals that believe it should be addressed one way, and then on the left politically, you have individuals who believe it should be addressed another way, right? So in this renewed claims, this third stage of formalization of policy determination of renewed claims, you have individuals basically kind of looking at, okay, how exactly are we supposed to solve it or address it, and what does it look like if this problem is addressed, and what should it look like if this problem is addressed? The same thing with school shootings, the same thing with drug use, the same thing with homelessness, the same thing with any of the social problems that you think about, right? There's the pornography, any poor education, hard drug use, domestic violence, whatever it is, the social problem you think about. And the last stage is the developmental stage, which is where you have these back and forth kind of movements around the particular social problem that's been addressed. Specifically, if the means and the renewed claims around the social problem have been effective and led to a decline, then you ultimately have either the resolution of that social problem, which is very unlikely, or you have the development of other issues that present themselves in tandem with that development and how to address those things, right? So you have basically an evolving, in the fourth stage, you have an evolving kind of development around the social problem and its solutions, okay? So those are the stages, the four stages associated with it. I've given you the example of undocumented migration and others, among others. And then you do have this reform, right? Because generally, as you reform these particular social problems, and you end up with like other problems as a result. So for example, if you think about prohibition, and the way we reformed it was we certainly passed the amendment to say, no, you know what, we're not going to ban alcohol. And now we end up with alcoholism, we end up with 3-strike laws, we end up with drunk driving, we end up with all of these different problems that come from, we end up with substance abuse and alcoholism. We end up with increased domestic violence as a result of alcoholism, right? So we solve one problem, but then we need to reform the issue because now we have other problems that present themselves in place of that resolution. Okay, all right. Another concept that's discussed in chapter 1 is the sociological imagination, and the big idea that you all need to see here is that in the United States we have very highly individualized understandings of the social problems that are present, and this is going to come to bear in chapter 2, where you have specific theories related to either individualistic explanations of poverty or structural explanations for poverty, right? So in the United States, when we look at any social problem, we look at it very highly individualized, where other cultures, especially non-Western societies, view things from a structural perspective. In the United States, we look at them as individualized perspectives, or from individualized perspectives. So the sociological imagination is helping people see the personal troubles that they have and relating them to not some kind of personal deficiencies, not to blaming the victim and not individualizing those problems, but rather seeing them from a structural perspective and looking at and understanding these problems in their lives as a consequence, not necessarily of the poor choices they made or of their work ethic or of their laziness or of their hard work, but more the product of the structural factors that lead to the organization as a society that they're a part of. Okay. And so it's troubles and issues, right? The troubles are the personal problems you have, and then the issues are the structural conditions that contribute to the personal problems or the troubles that people have, right? So issues are social in nature, troubles are personal in nature. I'll give you one example, right? We have, in the United States, we have one of the highest rates of children being raised in single parent households, and that's related very clearly to the freedoms that we have in our society, right? We can marry in our society, we can divorce, but it's also related to the freedom that we have in choosing our partners. It's related to the fact that in our culture, we design marriage in a way that benefits men and disadvantages women. And just one example is like, think about who's doing the work that is monotonous, that's daily, and that never ends inside of your home. In a traditional family, you probably have women doing more of that labor. And a good example is like this coming Thanksgiving. Think about, I want you to sit down I want you to observe on your Thanksgiving day, who's working on Thanksgiving. Is it your dad? Is it the males in the home? Are they the ones in the kitchen? Are they the ones cleaning up? Are they the ones doing the laundry? Or is it the women in the home? More than likely, you're going to see a lot more active labor from the females in your home on Thanksgiving than you do the men. And that goes back to, again, this idea of the sociological imagination, realizing that we structure marriage in our society, and marriage is just one example, or divorce is just one example, where women enter a relationship that guarantees them work for the rest of their lives, work towards their husband, work for their family, work for their children. And men, actually, when they enter a marriage, and a heterosexual marriage at least, men will find a helper. They find in the marriage, they enter a marriage relationship and they have someone that's going to help them, not just with the labor, right, of cooking and cleaning and doing those things that they'd have to do by themselves if they stay single, but also even in economic participation and economic productivity. All right. So that's the sociological imagination in a nutshell. When you look at social problems, it's really important to look at the broader issues that contribute to the social problems that people identify in their lives and in the broader society in which they live. So your chapter one also kind of goes into different theoretical perspectives, and there's sub theories associated with each of these, but the bigger the three main theories are here on this chart. This is taken straight out of your book. You can find there's functionalism. Traditionally, it was called structural functionalism. There's conflict theory, and then there's symbolic interactionism. So you can see here, when you're talking about functionalism, what you're really talking about is society is kind of like an organism, and the organism needs all of these structures to function properly in order to have a coherent and a stable society, right? If you have and some of the structures in society include the economic structures or institutions, the family institution or structure, the education institution or structure, right? Like functionalism is related to these structures, these macro structures that are present in any and every society, and the stability or the homeostasis of those structures, of those institutions, in order to keep the society healthy. So if you have a breakdown in the economy, then you're going to have a breakdown in the family, or you're going to have a breakdown in the education system, right? If you have a breakdown in the education system, you're going to have a breakdown in the political system. So, for example, there's a strong relationship between the level of educational attainment that people have and their likelihood of incarceration. So the more education you acquire, the less likely you are to be arrested and incarcerated, right? So when you look at it from a functional perspective, another good example that I'll give you from my own personal experiences is being raised in a single parent family household. All of the research shows that you have a greater risk or likelihood of incarceration, and greater likelihood of substance abuse, a greater likelihood of physiological, actually not physiological, psychological and emotional disturbances, right? Like social anxiety, depression, et cetera, overt aggression, those kind of things, right? So you'll be in a functionalist perspective, like you need the family to be healthy, you need the education system to be healthy, you need the economy to be healthy in order to have a healthy society. And this is how they've used the social problems, right? If there's a breakdown in one, your book also talks about functions and dysfunctions and manifest functions. So you just got to kind of keep that in mind. There's also the conflict theory, and conflict theory says that a lot of the social problems in our society are very much strongly related to the race, the class, the gender, and other forms of difference that people possess. And more broadly speaking, those differences being ways by people with power or people with resources or people with privilege or people with opportunity to exert oppressive dynamics into other people's lives are able to really kind of reinforce their control. So when you have when you look at a good example, and you're going to see this in chapter 2, but a good example is when you look at who's poor in our society, it's not a coincidence that it's women, because women are a minority. Numerically, they're not a minority. Numerically, women are a majority. But when we talk about minority and majority populations, we're talking about power. We're not talking about numbers. So women are a minority, even though they have more women, numerically speaking, in our society. And that's because of the differential power they have. The same thing when you look at poverty. It's not racially. It's not a coincidence that you have higher rates of poverty from a conflict perspective for racial minorities, because they are not dominant group members. Okay. And again, it extends itself in lots of different ways. And then the last theory is symbolic interactionism. And symbolic interactionism as a theory says that you have these different, and this is different from the other two, because the other two theories, functionalism and conflict theory, are macro theories. And under conflict theory, you also have critical race theory, you also have feminist theory, you have critical theory, you have all these different kinds of theories, but sub-theories. Symbolic interactionism is a very micro theory. It's a micro sociological theory. And this theory says that it's not about these big ideas like your race or your gender, or even your family or your education system. It's about how you as individuals, how we as individuals interact with one another, and with the symbols that we find meaning from, and how we engage in behaviors and are motivated by the particular symbols that we interact with on a daily basis, right? That's why it's called symbolic interactionism. So what this theory says about social problems is that social problems come from the micro interactions that people have with the symbols that they're interacting with. So for example, when you look at, and I'm trying to think of, like, when you look at poverty is a good example because it's related to chapter 2. When you look at poverty is a problem, right? And you look at the spending habits that people in poverty have, and the spending habits that people in the middle class have, and the spending habits that people in the wealthy, that are rich, have. They have different types of spending habits, right? So sometimes you have people in poverty that buy, that are living in, for example, low-income housing or government housing, what we used to call the projects when I was little, because I used to live in the projects. I lived all my life in low-income housing. These individuals would buy like a $65,000 Cadillac or a $35,000 Chrysler 300, right? They don't have the resources, but they engage in consumption patterns or patterns of consumption that reinforce these dynamics, right? And for example, people in the middle class, they put their money into insurance, life insurance, or they put their money into stocks or a 401k. That's something that people in poverty don't generally do. And of course, that's related very strongly to the resources and access to resources and opportunities that people have based on their socioeconomic location. But that's just one example of how symbolic interactionism works, okay? Conflict theory is very much associated with Karl Marx, and I already talked a little bit about that earlier. Here's an example of how conflict theory looks in terms of social problems related to poverty or income. This is from 1967 to 2014, right? So you have about 50 years, close to 50 years of data. If you look at the income that was received by the wealthiest 5% and then the poorest fifth of the population, what you find is here. Over these 50 years, the poorest in our society did not see any increase in their wages or in their income. Okay. Neither did the top, the lowest 40% or the lowest 60% or even the lowest 80%. Okay. This green line probably represents the middle class. So the middle class started in 1967 with about $60,000 and ended close to 90,000. So they saw a little bit of an increase. The middle class over 50 years saw like a $30,000 increase, which is not too much. I mean, I guess you could say it's about a 30% increase, okay, in their income over the course of 50 years. But you compare that to the wealthiest 5%, right? So in 1967, the wealthiest 5% were making about $175,000 a year. In 2014, 50 years later, they were making about $325,000. So they saw 100% increase, right? A conflict theorist would say that's not a coincidence. Who got wealthy during this period of time were the wealthiest people, and who stayed poor were the poorest people, right? So that's kind of conflict theory 101 right there. From a functionalist perspective, we already talked a little bit about that. I could kind of give you the example of like, if, for example, let's think about the developmental outcomes we want for everybody. We want people to be employed. We want people to have healthy families. We want people to have high quality educations and to be college educated, or at least educated in some kind of vocational skill set that allows them to be economically viable. But if you think about it, right, what happens, how likely are those developmental outcomes if you're raised in an extremely poor neighborhood, okay? Or if you're raised in an area that is extremely violent or crime-ridden, right? So from a functionalist perspective, your likelihood of these developmental outcomes is going to be influenced by the economy, by the family structure that you have in place, by the political systems that are in place, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what functionalism is all about, because the developmental outcomes for people in poverty are shaped by those dynamics, structurally speaking, institutionally, and it leads to different outcomes for different people, okay? So, for example, it's not a coincidence that people, when coming from, generally speaking, people from two-parent households have higher likely educational attainment or even educational performance. Like all the sociological research shows that. So that's another example. And then the symbolic interaction as an example I gave you is, and there's other theories. There's these sub-theories like learning theory, labeling theory. But I gave you the example, for example, of how people in poverty respond to spending money versus people with resources, people who are wealthy. And it goes to any other number kind of different dynamics, okay? A good example would be child abuse, right? Like, what is child abuse? If you define child abuse and its definition is very much strongly related to what is abuse, right? Growing up, I was, from a symbolic interaction perspective, you know, my mother used to hit me with a wire hanger when I would get bad grades. My mother used to hit me with a chancla, which is a sandal in Spanish. Chancla is in English translated as sandal. So my mother used to hit me with a gancho, a hanger, and a chancla or sandal, or sometimes even just whatever she had within her arm's reach. It would constitute child abuse, right? But in the 1980s, like, child abuse wasn't really on people's radar. Even today, right, questions about how, and culturally speaking, there's differences, right? In the middle class, all the research shows, right, the middle class parents generally talk to their children for corrective parenting practices. But you also find that the use of corporal or physical correction is related to educational attainment. People with less education generally correct or you see physical correction as an acceptable means of training or raising their children. So the higher level of education you attain, the less likely you are to use physical correction as a means of raising your child. So that's a little bit about that. Now, going into the end of chapter 1, your book discusses a number of different ways around how sociological research is done. And so it ranges from field work to doing surveys to secondary data analysis to doing case studies to doing experiments. And so there's lots of information around there. And the basic idea is that, when we study sociology, when we study social problems, it's not like you can study it like cancer. Cancer you can put into a petri dish, you can look at it under a microscope, and you can see the cancer cells engaging in mitosis or meiosis, and you can also see the cancer cells reproducing and doing all these different kind of things. You can't do that with racism. You can't put racism in a petri dish. You can't even go ask people if they're racist, because guess what? Everybody says no. You can't ask people if they abuse their children, because everyone says no. You can't ask anybody if they beat their wives, right? So if you're studying the sociological the phenomena, if you're studying sociology, it's a lot harder to figure out how to get to the results, right? How to figure out that, because child abuse exists, but how do you know? How do you find it? You know that racism exists. You know that discrimination exists. You know that sexism, that homophobia, just like cancer and all these other things that are real. But from a sociological perspective, it's a lot more challenging to study that stuff, because you can't, if you're a geologist, you can weigh the rock, but you can't weigh racism. How do you weigh racism? How do you weigh prejudice? How do you weigh discrimination, right? All of those kind of things. So these are some of the ways which we as sociologists or other sociologists engage in research to find the answers they're looking for, okay? And there's really lots of cool things that sociologists do. So I mentioned surveys. We can go ask, and we can go and talk to people. The downside is that it's very expensive, and the strength of it is that you can generalize. If you survey enough people, you get a representative sample, you have a pretty good idea of what people think. Secondary data analysis is also good because it's inexpensive. The only problem is that because you're not the one acquiring the data, you don't know if there's errors in the acquisition of the data or even in the recording of the data. And so it's kind of a give or take on that. We do have some pretty good solid studies that of secondary analysis that sociologists can run multiple regressions on and stuff like that. When we talk about experiments, there's something called the experimental group and then the control group. But the idea is experiments are good for causation, right? Because you can see prior order, pre-order. And usually when you're looking at experiments, you're looking at some kind of independent variable that leads to a particular change in a dependent variable. And these are just some of the examples. So Solomon Asch looked at group conformity. He had a really interesting experiment kind of looking at what people do when in a group, and people go with the group, in lots of different ways. And we saw that certainly in the Holocaust, for example. Philip Zimbardo, he actually has a couple of interesting studies. His most famous is the Stanford County Prison experiment, but he also has something called the Lucifer effect, which is really kind of looking at why people do things when they're good people, but they do evil things, right? Like, and usually it's this dynamic, that's these structural factors that are contributing to the deviant behavior they engage in. And then Stanley Milgram was another really famous example. There were some very unethical practices being done during the Holocaust. And so ethics are really paramount when it comes to these experiments. You want to kind of be very transparent about what exactly it is you're studying. Deceitfulness is not necessarily something you want to engage in when you're doing social experiments. But Stanley Milgram found, he did a really interesting study where he had these scientists wearing these white coats, and he recruited people, and he made these participants in the study think that they were electrocuting someone on the other side for getting an answer wrong to a particular question or saying something wrong. And what he was trying to do was see like how far people will go to obey authority. And well, he found that, yeah, so what he did is he said, okay, whenever this person gets the answer wrong, I want you to hit the button, and that's going to shock them. And on the other side, no one was being shocked, but they had like this voice recording that said, ow, ow, you're hurting me, it's electrocuting me. So every time they got a wrong answer, these people were told, hit the button, electrocute that person. And because they were obeying authority, they continually repeatedly electrocuted people or shocked people. And his study found that they would obey people even to the point of basically taking another person's life, because they were told to do that by an authority figure. So these are just some of the social experiments that are out there. When we talk about the the social research component. Like I said, ethics is paramount. Now, chapter 2 is talking about this poverty. It's looking at poverty in a lot of different ways. So as I was sharing, when we let me see if we get back here. Sorry about that, everybody. My sincerest apologies. As I was sharing with you, when we talk about the poor, well, my wife is calling, so give me one second. All right, everybody, I should be good now. Okay, my sincerest apologies. So as I was sharing, chapter 2 talks about poverty, lots of different discussions around the various aspects of poverty. One of the things I want you all to kind of keep in mind is the chapter begins with discussing who is poor. So it's not a coincidence that in our society, children are poor. They are also a minority in terms of the power that they possess in the society we live in. White Americans are poor. There are more white Americans, numerically speaking, than any other population. Although, even though there's more white Americans in poverty than any other racial or ethnic demographic, I will tell you that proportionately there are higher rates of poverty for Black and other racial minorities than there are for Black Americans and other racial minorities than there are for whites. Okay, so that's one distinction that needs to be made. The other distinction is that when white Americans are in poverty, their poverty is acute as opposed to the chronic poverty or prolonged poverty that people of other various racial or ethnic minorities have to experience and contend with. Okay, so racial minorities are poor, have elevated rates of poverty, and then they're poorer for longer periods of time than white Americans, even though there are more white Americans who are poor. And then there's also the gender dynamic to poverty, which is called the feminization of poverty. So the largest segment of people in poverty in terms of gender are females. And usually that's related to the added cost of child rearing, the lower wages that women earn, and then some of the sectors of the economy, some of the pink collar sectors of the economy that women are moved into through the process of socialization and then other broader social forces at work. Okay, all right, so that's a little bit about that. The theoretical perspectives associated with poverty can be, again, just kind of very briefly, succinctly discussed. So there's a modern functionalist theory that basically says that people in poverty are basically, poverty is a function of these broader dynamics that work in our society. And generally, the work that people do is commensurate with their compensation. So the more important, quote unquote, the more important work that people do, the more likely it is that they're going to be rewarded richly for the important work they do. And then also not just the more important work they do, but the more important work that people do is related to the more important skill set and the more rare skill set or vital skill set that's associated with completion of that important work. And hence you have a greater degree of compensation for people with a greater degree of specificity, a greater degree of expertise, as well as a greater performance of an important task. And so I've given you this idea, and that's very much strongly related to the meritocratic ideology or the meritocracy that we as a society subscribe to, the myth of a meritocracy, I would say. So it's not a coincidence that when you go to college and you earn your Associate of Arts, you get a likelihood of an increase in your income potential than a high school graduate. If you go on to get a 4-year degree, your Bachelor of Arts or your Bachelor of Science, then you're more likely to earn greater returns on your degree than if you had an AA or a high school diploma. It's not a coincidence that when you go on to get a master's degree, right, whether a Master of Science, a Master of Arts, a Master of Art in Teaching, whatever that master's is, then you're more likely to earn more money with a master's than you are with an associate's, and certainly more than you are with a high school diploma. And then going on further to acquire the expertise associated with a Doctor of Philosophy, a PhD, a Doctor of Education, or an MD. It's not a coincidence that these doctors earn more money than any of the other degree credentials that people can earn, right? So, and that's because the more education you receive, the greater specialization and the greater level of education and knowledge, as well as skill set that you generally will possess. So you compare a PhD in terms of the critical thinking, in terms of the writing skill set, in terms of the ability to consume academic literature compared to someone who drops out of high school, you're going to find two very different skill sets. And so we pay the doctor $200,000, $300,000 a year, and we would not pay necessarily the high school dropout more than maybe $15, $16 an hour, depending on what the economy can support. Okay, so associated with the functionalist perspective is also the degree of compensation associated with the work that people do actually leads to the motivation factor, right? Because if you go, okay, how long does it take to get your AA, right? Well, it takes 12 years to get your high school diploma. And then it takes another, what does it take? It takes another 2 years to get your AA, right? So now you have 14 years of education. And then it takes another 4 years to get a BA. So that's now 18 years of education. To get an MA, let's say 16 years to get your BA. You get your MA, that's another 2 or 3 years, that's 18 years or 16 years, depending on how you're counting. And then to get a PhD generally, or an MD, you're looking at another 4 to 6 years, right? So you're looking at something like 20 years of education. And so someone with 20 years of education can expect to earn a much larger salary or a much higher salary, and has a potential for a much higher salary than someone who goes to school for only 12 years, right? Because those, there's something called opportunity costs, right? So the costs that people bear for going to school for that long are not just financial, you know, they're in terms of the relationship status that people have, in terms of the investment of resources they have. I mean, there's just all these opportunity costs that have to be taken into consideration. So it's not a coincidence we don't pay the garbage collector more than we pay the medical doctor, right? Because now one of the limitations that the book discusses, and that many other theorists would say to a functionalist, one of the criticisms is, how do you determine what's more important work, right? Like, what is more important, the doctor who treats you for cancer, or the teacher who trained the doctor to be able to read and write when they were in kindergarten, right? Like, how do you determine, and what's to say that the person collecting our fruits that works in the fields or that works in the factory is not as important as the teacher, or not as important as the garbage collector, and not as important as the doctor, right? So that's one of the criticisms that's leveled against the functionalist theory of poverty. Another theory, another theoretical explanation for poverty is conflict theory. And conflict theory is related to this idea, again, of power and the unequal distribution of resources that are scarce is related very much to access to opportunity and power that people possess. So it's not a coincidence, and I'll give you the example of the incarceration rate right here, these young men in prison. It's not a coincidence that people in poverty are more likely to be arrested. That doesn't mean that people in poverty are more likely to be criminals. It just means they're more likely to be arrested. And that's directly related to their lack of access to resources to afford a lawyer when they do interact with police or law enforcement, right? So people in poverty have fewer resources, and because they have fewer resources, they're not able to get a good quality education, generally speaking, or they're not able to get some of the other resources or access to opportunities and resources that other people with resources would have. So it's not a coincidence, again, that the largest number of people in poverty happen to be female, right? There's a feminization of poverty. It's not a coincidence that the people in poverty, that people of racial or ethnic minority identity have higher rates of poverty than white Americans, because those are two demographics that are minorities in terms of access and opportunity and power. Okay. All right. And then symbolic interactionism is also one of the theories. I'll talk very briefly before I go into some of the anti-poverty policies that are in place. But generally what happens is symbolic interactionism is related to how people make sense of the social realities that they're interacting with. So as I mentioned in the lecture related to chapter 1, people in poverty have different spending or consumption patterns. People with resources have different consumption patterns, right? People in poverty label themselves, or actually internalize oppressive conditions, oppressive identifiers that are generally constructed by people with resources about people in poverty, right? So that's the symbolic interactionist perspective. The idea of, for example, the cultural poverty, the idea that these erroneous ideas we get about people in poverty, that people in poverty are lazy or they're irresponsible or whatever. Like, this is coming from not the poor themselves, but people with resources who get who have the power and the access to the power to frame people in poverty a particular way. All right, so your book talks about some of the anti-poverty ways or anti-poverty responses to the problem of poverty that we have as a society. This is just one example, but once a social problem like poverty has been identified, then you have this back and forth regarding how to resolve that problem. So the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 began something called the War on Poverty. And it was basically the expansion of particular social programs to try to mitigate either the consequences of poverty or to prevent the causes of poverty, right? So it's kind of like a two-pronged assault on poverty as a whole. During the 60s and 70s, a lot of studies found that because there was a social safety net in place, that women left their marriages at higher rates. Unemployment durations increased, so people stayed unemployed for longer periods of time, and people worked less. And that, of course, on the surface, could be used as an argument to cut welfare, right? People on the right would say, what you're doing is you're discouraging women from staying in marriages. You're discouraging people from going to look for work. You're discouraging people from wanting to be employed if you provide them resources to protect them from poverty. And then, of course, people on the other side, on the left side, would say, no, 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 no. Like, we don't want people to stay in marriages if they're being abused, right? Even if it's going to increase the likelihood of poverty, we don't want them to stay there because that's unhealthy for the children and for the family as a whole. We don't want people to stay in conditions that are going to be difficult for them. So there's these discussions between the left and the right, politically speaking. So with the Economic Opportunity Act, you had Head Start, which basically is early childhood interventions, because we know that education is very strongly, and quality of education is very strongly correlated with life outcomes and life chances. We had the implementation of Job Corps, which is this federal program that begins to equip people with the skills that they can use to become vocationally employed. During the 80s, when we expanded welfare, we did see a rise in crime. We had longer stints of unemployment for people. We had an increase of births out of wedlock, out of marriage, single parent family household structures also. And then you also had these broader social factors at work. You had deindustrialization, you had globalization, you had the suburbanization of the modern society in which we live. You still had dynamics of discrimination and then processes of gentrification that are continually presenting themselves in our time as well. During the 1990s, you had the election of President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, which introduced the end of welfare as we know it. You had temporary assistance to needy families. You had the introduction of specific criteria that people who were receiving self-welfare or support systems from the social safety net were required to meet particular things. So you had food stamps, you had Medicaid, you had Medicare under the Economic Opportunity Act. And then during the 2000s to the present, we have what's called post-welfare reform. So you still have these back and forth between conflicting ideologies about how to solve poverty. Okay. Now, some of the problems of poverty, they're manifold, okay, they're myriad, but here are just some of the consequences that I'm going to talk about that your book discusses. The first one is that we have one of the most unequal societies in the industrialized world. Okay, like our society is a highly unequal society. What that means for us is, generationally speaking, poverty has a likelihood of being transmitted from parents to children. Like there is generational transmission of poverty, just like there is general transmission of affluence or of resource-rich environments. So that's one thing. There's something called the Gini coefficient, which basically measures the inequality in societies. And our Gini coefficient has just freaking skyrocketed, okay? You have political alienation. So that's a consequence of the increased incarceration of people in poverty or people without resources. It's not a coincidence that people in poverty have lower voting participation rates than people in the middle class and people in the upper class, right? We have a mass incarceration of poor people in our society. And not just a mass incarceration of poor people, we have a mass incarceration of poor people, of people with mental health disorders, and then also people of racial or ethnic minority identity. Some of the problems of poverty extend to the physical and mental health that people have, right? So if you're poor, you don't live as long, right? You have a lower life expectancy, lower mortality. The mortality rate is related to your poverty or your proximity to poverty. And then also your access to mental health therapy, mental health resources is also not as clear. Family stability is related to poverty. You know, it's not, for those of you that are married, you know that one of the greater points of conflict in marriages is related to resources. Homelessness is one of the problems we're seeing, not just here not just here in our community in Yakima, but also in other communities across the country. As I mentioned to you before, we have an increased issue presenting itself economically when it comes to the criminal justice system. People in poverty can't afford defense, legal defense. They can't afford a $5,000 retainer to get a good lawyer. And then we also, as a society, cannot afford to incarcerate the large numbers of people we're incarcerating, because every person we put behind bars requires tax money to feed, to house, to shelter, and to clothe, and sometimes to educate, especially if we have a rehabilitation kind of perspective to incarceration instead of an incapacitation approach to incarceration. And last but not least, poverty has educational implications. You know, all the research shows that there's tracking that takes place. So people with resources and people without resources are tracked into different systems within the educational system. And that's also kind of overlaid by racial and ethnic dynamics as well as ability dynamics. Okay. All right. So that is the end of the lecture. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Hope you enjoy it.